For many fans in the West, Aqua Plus Incorporated may not exactly be a household name. Fans of Atlas USA may recognize their logo from several games released by the publisher in the 2010s, including a fighting game featuring characters many were unfamiliar with at the time, and a fan-servicey dungeon crawler on the PlayStation Vita, one of many that graced the platform. But for people that walk in certain circles, Aqua Plus is most well known as the creators of the Utawarerumono series, a well-regarded franchise that mixes visual novel storytelling with strategy RPG gameplay. Looking at the company's small handful of officially localized titles, Aqua Plus may seem innocuous and unimportant at first glance, yet another niche developer selling text-heavy games starring moe anime girls. However, in actuality, they are the parent company of one of the single most influential developers of the late 90s, a subsidiary that created several classic franchises, garnered great influence within Japan's doujin scene, and who, for all intents and purposes, pioneered the visual novel genre as we know it today. This is the story of Leaf, an adult PC developer that was the poster child for how a passionate fanbase could help raise a studio up out of obscurity, and later turn against them not long after they found success during the beginning of the new millennium. The story begins with the founding of a small studio called U-Office in the city of Atami. U-Office was an outsourcing company that created video game music for other developers, that was established by several composers on October 3, 1994. This includes its founder, Naoya Shimakawa, along with Shinji Orito. These two had been friends since high school, where they bonded over their love of video game music, along with other future collaborators such as Shinya Ishikawa and Kazuhide Nakagami. Shimakawa and Orito initially got their start in the game industry creating music at TGL, where they worked on franchises like Variable Geo and Farland Story. Around the same time, Shimakawa and his friends were also collaborating with other artists to create original doujin albums that were sold at fan events, which eventually led to the group setting out on their own to establish U-Office, sort of as a natural extension of their doujin activities. Not long after, one of U-Office's contractors invited the studio to not only create music for two projects, but to create the title's graphics as well. So Shimakawa gathered some of his graphic artist friends and went to work with his new team of about 5 people, but the company ended up losing money on both projects. After discussing the matter with everyone, Shimakawa decided that if they were going to end up in the red regardless, they might as well lose money on their own games rather than someone else's outsourced material. Thus, while still continuing their outsourced work, U-Office began making their first original title. However, there was a problem.
They lived only to face a new nightmare.
U-Office had plenty of artists and composers, but they didn't have a single programmer. This led to Shimakawa getting in contact with a freelancer and purchasing code they had made for a mahjong game, leading to the company's first release being a mahjong title simply because they had no other option. In Japan, a large portion of the PC market was made up of eroge titles, erotic video games, and strip mahjong titles were very popular. Perhaps because of this, U-Office decided to make their mahjong game an adult release. And so, similar to companies like TGL, U-Office established a subsidiary called Leaf, which would focus on making adult games, while U-Office would publish the team's mainstream releases. The name Leaf came from the idea that even a large tree first starts out as a single leaf, and that their small company would similarly turn into a huge studio in the future. With this hope in their hearts, the team at Leaf released their first title in February 1995 for the NEC PC-98 computer, called DR2 Night Jonki, a fantasy-themed title where the user plays mahjong against various monster girls. The game's development had been fast and hectic. First of all, there was apparently only one person at Leaf that even knew how to play mahjong, and the staff were unable to fix any issues with the gameplay since the code had been outsourced. On top of that, part of the game's data was lost and had to be recreated due to an earthquake. most likely the Great Hanshin earthquake that rocked the Hyogo prefecture in January 1995. It's surprising the game came out at all, and yet, in no time, the team quickly went to work releasing their next game. Since Leaf was so restricted with their first title, the company hired a programmer for their next project, which would end up being a role-playing game. RPGs were by far the staff's favorite genre, so a lot of passion went into making this new title. In fact, the company would end up releasing 2 RPGs only a few months after their debut into the industry. The first was an adult title released in August 1995 under the Leaf brand, called Filznone, and the other was a mainstream title released by U-Office in November, called Legam. Over the course of just a single year, the company had gone from being a tiny outsourcing office to releasing 3 original titles. While the team was proud of the work they had done on these games, often specifically showing off Filznone to new employees, none of these releases were very successful. U-Office and Leaf had basically no name recognition, and their games didn't exactly stand out in a market full of RPGs and mahjong games. The company needed a product that would help Leaf make a name for itself, perhaps something in a less crowded genre. Back in the console market, a developer named Chunsoft had recently released a murder mystery game for the Super Famicom in 1994 called Kamatachi no Yoru. The game played like a digital choose-your-own-adventure book that Chunsoft was calling a sound novel. The player would basically just read text while minimalist graphics and atmospheric sound design enhanced the mood. It was a simple experience where the player's only interaction was selecting choices that would branch the story in a number of directions, with the goal being to get the ending where the characters discover the murderer's true identity. However, despite its simplicity, Kamatachi no Yoru exploded in popularity in Japan, where it eventually sold over 700,000 copies, leading to other developers quickly flooding the market with their own take on the sound novel formula. However, while a small handful of sound novels had been released on consoles by 1995, the new genre had not yet reached the PC space. Seeing the genre's growing popularity within the industry, and even among his own staff, Naoya Shimakawa saw an opportunity to make a sound novel for the PC market, so he got in contact with a new employee to see if he could lead the project. That new employee was a writer named Tetsuya Takahashi. Takahashi had recently left his job at Taito so he could work with his friend Toru Minazuki, an artist that had previously been employed at TGL but was now a character designer at Leaf. The two of them had been friends since college, and had even created a doujin manga in the recent past, and they both apparently belonged to the same Dungeons & Dragons group. Now the two would team up again for Leaf's new sound novel project. Takahashi had just joined the company as development on Filznone was wrapping up, and had only served as a tester on Legam. At the time, some of the staff were throwing around ideas for a sequel to Filznone, and Takahashi was thinking of making some kind of simulation game when he spoke to Shimakawa over the phone. Shimakawa expressed that he wanted to make a game similar to Kamatachi no Yoru, and Takahashi stated that he was confident he could get the job done. And so, all other projects were pushed to the side, and development on this new novel game began. Takahashi, Minazuki, and the rest of the team set out to make an atypical entry in the sound novel genre, something that would stand out and hopefully draw more attention to Leaf as a developer. Every sound novel at the time was a typical horror mystery of some kind. Takahashi also looked to make a horror title, but instead wanted to make something more psychological in order for the game to stand out among its peers, taking inspiration from the novels of Kenji Otsuki and Hollywood films like Silence of the Lambs. However, while Takahashi and his team were given free rein to make what they wanted, they were also given a few stipulations that the game must follow. For example, the story had to be set in a high school with characters wearing uniforms, the protagonist had to be male, and the player had to be able to reach the first erotic scene within 5 minutes of starting the game. Following these oddly specific guidelines, the team created their novel game, which they titled with a single kanji character that read Shizuku. The title was released in January 1996 and followed the story of a young student investigating why one of the most popular girls at his school seemingly went mad in the middle of class. Not only was the subject matter different from most sound novels of the era, but the presentation was also unique. Unlike Chunsoft's titles, which never showed the characters directly, Shizuku had detailed character portraits and even event illustrations for important scenes, making the title a far more visual experience. Before the game was even released, a follow-up was already being planned that would reuse Shizuku's systems. So Takahashi came up with a brand name that would connect these games into a franchise, similar to Chunsoft's sound novel brand. And since Shizuku focused more on visuals rather than sound, the game was labeled as the first volume in the Leaf visual novel series. Thus the word visual novel was coined for the very first time, a term that would later take on a life of its own within the Western community. In order to make a profit, Shizuku needed to sell at least 5,000 copies. But upon its release, Eroge fans criticized Leaf's visual novel for covering the game's graphics with screen-filling walls of text. However, over time, Shizuku eventually ended up selling 7,000 copies. And after the second visual novel was released in July, called Kizawato, criticisms of Leaf's visual novels began to disappear, as the series began to build a cult following. These new fans enjoyed the franchise's focus on storytelling and narrative, with the erotic content itself not really being the main selling point. But more than that, these fans were becoming very attached to the cute bishoujo characters featured in the series, which led to many fans creating secondary works based on Leaf's games. These fan works often took the form of doujinshi, self-published manga, magazines, and other printed material that were sold to fellow fans at various events. Seeing this growing fandom within the doujin scene, Leaf began catering to this community by releasing a budget game called Sayorin to Ushio, basically a digital fanzine that included minigames, bonus scenarios, news about upcoming releases, results to character popularity polls, and other goodies featuring their characters, the first of many that would eventually be called the Leaf Amusement Soft series. The title also spotlighted the doujin works being created by their community, with the game containing an entire section cataloging stuff made by their fans. The way Leaf acknowledged and celebrated these works intertwined them closely with Japan's doujin community of the time. Leaf's acceptance of doujin works perhaps shouldn't be too surprising, since Leaf themselves were practically a doujin group at the time, being founded by a group of friends that had previously created their own doujin works. With this newfound interest in Leaf's characters, the company looked to make them the focus of their third visual novel, a move that would put Leaf on the map and inspire an entire generation of creators. After completing Kizawato, Takahashi and his team moved right along into planning the next visual novel. Volume 3 was initially going to be a fantasy story, similar in tone to the previous two installments. But after making two oppressive works back to back, the team decided to make something a bit more lighthearted, and maybe a bit more romantic. Because you see, during the same period that sound novels were blowing up, another genre was also growing in popularity: the dating sim. In 1994, Tokimeki Memorial had become a hit on the PC Engine CD, but once it was ported to the PlayStation in 1995, it had become a nationwide phenomenon. Adventure games themed around dating had been popular in the PC market, but Tokimeki's cheery high school setting and charming love interests drew in a whole new audience and gave birth to a dating sim boom in the mid to late 90s. Playing off this trend, Takahashi worked with Minazuki to make Leaf's third visual novel a romantic comedy, borrowing heavily from the tone and setting of these dating sims. But instead of focusing on stat building, this game would retain the branching novel structure of Leaf's past titles, but now the player would be making choices to court different girls instead of trying to solve a mystery or obtain a true ending. The overall narrative this time around was far less important, and the focus was instead placed on the stories of the individual heroines. In fact, each character had so much story that Takahashi was finding it difficult to write unique scenarios for the title's 9 love interests. So he split the work with another writer named Akihide Takabayashi, who wrote 4 of the game's scenarios. Takabayashi was a longtime friend of Takahashi's and had previously contributed to Kizuato, where he wrote a bonus scenario for the game, but Two Heart would be his first project as an actual Leaf employee. Additionally, Minazuki would also obtain some extra help from artist Hisashi Kawada, a graphic designer that had been with the company almost since the beginning, getting his start creating the artwork and scenario for Legam back in '95. The way the work was split was that Minazuki would design the heroines for Takahashi's scenarios, while Kawada would illustrate Takabayashi's characters. The company's third visual novel was becoming a far bigger endeavor than Leaf's previous titles, and there was a lot of uncertainty on whether it would succeed. While Volume 3 had some hype leading up to its release, staff were worried that their new audience wouldn't like the change in tone compared to their past visual novels, and they were anxious about the fact that this would be the company's first big exclusive for Windows-based computers. However, despite all this uncertainty, the third Leaf visual novel, called Two Heart, launched on May 23, 1997, and it blew away all expectations. Two Heart turned out to be a huge sales success for a small company like Leaf. While today, book-style video games that focus purely on character interaction are nothing new, back in 1997, it was a novel idea. While Leaf's previous visual novels had romantic elements, and there had been some novel-style eroge in the past, Two Heart was the first game to take the structure and presentation of Chunsoft's sound novels and explicitly make it about romancing different characters, a concept that fans couldn't get enough of. Even months after its release, the game would still rank high in eroge sales charts, and characters like the green-haired android-made Multi would often take first place in character popularity polls. The following year, Leaf moved on to their next title, a new game unrelated to the visual novel series called White Album. This new game was written by Udaru Harada and told a much more somber and grounded love story, and didn't have the same gameplay as Two Heart. While the game found its own success, Two Heart just continued to draw on fans, and its popularity kept growing and growing. Even before Two Heart, Leaf was beginning to realize that their games had mainstream appeal. Titles like Kizuato often ranked high in magazine polls of games readers wanted to see ported to home consoles. Seeing this feedback, Leaf decided to pitch Sony on the idea of porting Kizuato to the original PlayStation, but Sony was uninterested in seeing more PC ports brought to their platform at the time. So Leaf instead pitched them on a brand new project, but they never heard back from Sony. Thus, the staff decided to turn that project into a PC title instead, which eventually became Two Heart. And once Two Heart became a breakout success, Sony was more than happy to finally answer Leaf's calls and approve the project they had originally submitted. And so, Leaf's parent company, who had since changed their name from U-Office to Aqua in 1996, and finally Aqua Plus in 1997, began production on a PS1 release of Two Heart. But this would be no mere port, but a full-scale remake. Tetsuya Takahashi had learned a lot while making the original Two Heart, so now having a better understanding of the characters, he did an extensive rewrite of the story, removing all adult content and expanding the narrative of each heroine. The game's presentation was also extensively reworked. Around the time the PS1 port was approved, an anime adaptation of Two Heart was also greenlit, which was to be produced by OLM, the studio that had just begun making the wildly successful Pokemon anime in '97. Due to this, the game would share an anime opening with the TV show, with animated openings becoming somewhat of a tradition in future Leaf releases. On top of that, all of the in-game artwork was redrawn from scratch. The game's soundtrack was redone, characters were now fully voiced, minigames were added, and even a brand new love interest was written into the story. The title was almost a completely new game when it finally launched for the PlayStation on March 25th, 1999, under the name Two Heart, with no space for some reason. Before its release, a radio program called Two Heart began airing in 1998 to hype people up about the remake. OLM's anime adaptation began airing in February 1999, and various magazines gave the remake extensive coverage. So when Two Heart finally launched, fans were primed and ready to buy, which led to the title selling over 100,000 copies. While the game never reached the sales of popular titles like Tokimeki, Two Heart was still the biggest hit Leaf/Aqua Plus had yet achieved. This PS1 release ended up exposing an entirely new audience to Leaf's titles. In fact, some modern-day polls even indicate that games like Two Heart served as a gateway for many people into the Bishoujo game genre in general. This success accelerated Leaf's expansion into other industries, with them soon releasing tons of books, music CDs, and other media based on their properties. A card game was even created called Leaf Fight TCG, which was actually quite popular in its own right. Additionally, even before Two Heart's PlayStation release, Leaf had begun to grow in size. In 1998, the company acquired a large portion of the staff that had formerly worked at F&C Corporation, a company whose adult subsidiary Cocktailsoft was most famous for creating the Pia Carrot series. The staff that joined Leaf included the likes of artists Misato Misumi, Tatsuki Amazuyu, and Takeshi Nakamura, who would design the characters for many of Leaf's most popular future titles that would be directed by other former Cocktail employees, like Stomu Washimi, an artist himself that would become an active director while at Leaf. Among all the talent that joined the company, an eroge writer named Munimitsu Suga was also hired from the developer Silky, another key creator that would impact Leaf's future. This new group would found a Tokyo-based office that would create their own games separate from the head office in Atami, causing Leaf to become a two-team development studio. The Atami team would eventually get the reputation for making more serious titles, despite just releasing Two Heart, while the Tokyo office would become known for more poppy, light-hearted fare, despite eventually also making more serious titles. The first game to be released by the Tokyo office was actually published the same year as the Two Heart remake, a hybrid game called Comic Party, released in May 1999. The title combined the storytelling style of Leaf's novel games with management sim elements. White Album had similarly blended elements from different genres, but Comic Party would begin a trend where Leaf would make many hybrid titles in the years to come. The game's story revolved around the protagonists creating fan works for a fictionalized version of Comiket, an event in Tokyo where artists sell self-published works to fellow fans, many of which are based on pre-existing properties. This premise makes perfect sense considering Leaf's strong connections to the doujin scene and their active fan base. However, while fairly well known today, the doujin community was still considered fairly underground in the 90s, and Leaf's head office initially opposed the idea of making a game based on such a niche subject. But the game was eventually greenlit anyway, and Comic Party turned out to be a huge hit for its time. The game was seen as a love letter to the doujin scene, and to the company's most devoted fans, putting a spotlight on Comiket and otaku culture in a way that had not been done in a game before, and was surprisingly popular with fans and newcomers alike. With this 1-2 punch of Two Heart and now Comic Party, Leaf had finally launched into stardom. Outside of Japan, titles like Two Heart are a blip on the radar of old-school anime fans. But for fans in Japan, Two Heart and Leaf's other titles had a massive presence in the otaku fandom of the late 90s and early 2000s, influencing many future creators. Leaf's characters had been popular in the doujin scene for years, but Two Heart gave way to a huge increase in fan works. Two Heart's easy-to-understand character types and loose setting, which contained everything from the occult and even androids, gave fans a canvas where they could expand the story in a number of directions without breaking the worldview of the original work. The flexibility of Two Heart led to hundreds of artists creating doujinshi based on the game and Leaf's other properties. In fact, material featuring Leaf characters became so prevalent, the Comiket eventually created a category in 2001 solely for works based on their games, along with another company called Key. This wasn't limited to just print media either. Back in 1998, a small doujin group named Watanabe Shakusho created a game for the PC called The Queen of Heart. Inspired by similar doujin fighting games like Moonlights 2 and Tokimeki Taisen, The Queen of Heart was a 2D fighting game starring the cast of Two Heart that became one of the most successful fan games of its time, selling similar numbers to Two Heart itself. This led to a sequel and many other fan games from Watanabe Shakusho, until the group eventually changed their name to French Bread, where they have since become world famous within the fighting game community for creating games like Melty Blood and Under Night Ember. Leaf's games also had a dramatic effect on the eroge industry. After the release of Two Heart, the adult PC market was soon overrun by novel games, mimicking the style of Leaf's titles. One of the first was actually released by one of Leaf's founding members, composer Shinji Orito. Orito had left the company around 1997, where he eventually joined Tactics, a developer under Nexton. At the studio, he teamed up with a small team of creators to develop several games that were similar in style to the works he helped create at Leaf. The most famous of these was 1998's One, a title clearly inspired by Two Heart. Later, this team left Tactics and founded the previously mentioned Key under Visual Arts, where they would create several now famous novel games, such as K-On!, Air, and Clannad, which would become hugely influential in their own right. The similarities between Leaf and Key created a strong connection between the two companies, with fans of both studios often being lumped together, and even staff from both developers sometimes leaving one studio to go to the other. In fact, some fans even classified this era of novel games as the Leaf Key boom, since both companies inspired a wave of imitators. And, of course, Leaf's popularity led to the rise of several doujin novel games as well. A writer and programmer named Naoki Takahashi was a fan of Shizuku and Kizawato in the mid-90s, but when Two Heart was published, his fandom grew to another level. He soon began making his own fan works, and eventually got a job in the eroge industry, working on several titles throughout the years. But in 1999, Naoki Takahashi created what he is most famous for, a freeware novel game engine called Nscriptor. The tool allowed users to easily create novel games in the style of Leaf's titles, and could even be used for commercial products. While not the first of its kind, the accessibility of Nscriptor opened the floodgates for amateur creators to take their first steps into making their own novel games, with one of the first being made by a little group known as Type Moon. In the year 2000, the group released Tsukihime, a doujin novel created using Nscriptor that was so successful that it led to the group going pro and creating many iconic otaku franchises, such as the ever-popular Fate Multimedia Empire. During the group's early years, the founders took inspiration from titles like Two Heart while developing Tsukihime, and even borrowed Leaf's visual novel brand name to classify their games, which no other developer at the time did, with many even today simply marketing their novel titles as adventure games instead. Another notable Nscriptor creator was a young artist and writer known under the pen name Ryukishi07. Today, Ryukishi is famous for creating the When They Cry franchise, with titles like Higurashi and Yumineko being very popular around the world. Some of Ryukishi's first works he ever released to the public were actually doujinshi based on Leaf's properties. Looking at Higurashi in particular, it is very clear that Leaf had a strong influence on the creator, with the title bearing a strong resemblance to Kizawato in terms of themes, setting, and presentation. In fact, the soundtrack for an unreleased beta build of Higurashi was made up of repurposed tracks from various Leaf titles, including Kizawato. Additionally, Ryukishi07 even created popular unofficial cards for Leaf Fight TCG, which helped him become more well known in the doujin scene before releasing Higurashi. Even in the West, Leaf indirectly influenced many aspects of the VN fandom. For example, Nscripter's open nature made it easier for fans to begin making unofficial English translations for titles that ran on the engine. This led to a fan translation boom in the early 2000s, where many classic titles were brought over the language barrier, helping in many ways to establish the modern visual novel fandom in the West. Even Leaf's visual novel brand name would spread in the English-speaking community, and has since become the de facto term for all novel-style video games outside of Japan. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the many creators and communities that were affected by Leaf during this era. Leaf had finally hit the big times. Their properties were being enjoyed by thousands of people, their characters had become otaku icons, and their influence had spread far and wide. Leaf had finally become the great tree they had imagined when they were founded in 1994. However, as often happens when companies grow very quickly, not everything goes smoothly, and Leaf would soon find themselves at odds with the very fans they had just obtained. Only a few months after the release of Two Heart on the PlayStation, the now famous online message board NiChannel was formed, and fans of Leaf's titles were some of the first to take to this new platform. Discussions about Leaf's games were popular topics on the site, but only a few months after NiChannel's creation, a post would spark a huge controversy within the Leaf community. Akihide Takabayashi, the man that co-wrote Two Heart, was accused of plagiarism. The accusation was first made on December 21, 1999, in a NiChan thread discussing Kizawato, where the 23rd poster pointed out that the bonus scenario written by Takabayashi heavily resembled a 1979 short story called Deki Sugi. Inside a message included with Kizawato's CD-ROM release, Tetsuya Takahashi mentioned that Takabayashi's scenario was based on some other source material, perhaps implying that it was meant to be a parody, but fans on NiChan saw it as a far worse crime. The thread soon exploded, and NiChan's game board was flooded with debates over whether Kizawato's bonus story was plagiarism or parody. Other users quickly became annoyed by these never-ending discussions, so NiChannel ended up splitting the game board into 4 sections, and the Leaf fans were quarantined to the area dedicated to Eroge. However, even fellow Eroge fans couldn't stand the constant fighting among the Leaf fandom, and around the same time, topics related to Key's first game, K-On!, were also flooding the board. So it was decided that the Leaf community, along with fans of Key, would move to another message board called Pink Channel in January 2000, where they created a forum solely dedicated to talking about games made by the two companies, called the Leaf Keyboard. Here on this site, fans continued to fester over this plagiarism drama for months. In the offline world, the head office in Atami released their next big game after Two Heart, called Magical Antique, in April 2000. The game was headed by several newcomers at the studio, some of which had previously been known for creating doujinshi based on Leaf's games. Magical Antique was another hybrid title that turned out to be fairly popular upon its release, but behind the scenes, Leaf was experiencing a lot of internal struggles, and many notable people left the company later that year. The writer behind White Album, Udaru Harada, resigned in June 2000, and most shocking of all, Tetsuya Takahashi and Toru Minazuki quit working at the studio in July. The two creators behind the franchise that had put Leaf on the map were no longer employed at the company. They would initially contribute to some future projects as freelancers, but eventually set out on their own to pursue their own work. While all this was going on behind closed doors, an uneasy tension was beginning to build between Leaf and their fans. Besides the plagiarism drama, fans were upset about the establishment of new rules and limitations surrounding the creation of doujin works based on Leaf's games, a move that was seen as ironically two-faced since they had just released a game celebrating the doujin scene. At the same time, old-school fans were becoming dissatisfied with Leaf's recent output of bubbly, crowd-pleasing titles, and wanted the company to return to the darker themes explored in their earlier works. So when Leaf's next game was announced, called Tasogare, many of these fans were pretty excited, since it looked to return to the style of storytelling seen in Shizuku and Kizawato. However, despite strong sales after its launch on February 9, 2001, fans online quickly began dogpiling Tasogare when it didn't meet their expectations. Tasogare was ridiculed for its corny and bizarre dialogue, foreshadowing that went nowhere, and for the game simply being far too short for the scale of its narrative. Fans were also eager to hate on Tasogare since it was written by Akihide Takabayashi, who is still the center point of drama within the online community over a year later. Tasogare was Takabayashi's first game where he served as the lead writer, and he had the unenviable position of taking over the project after the departure of Udaru Harada, who had previously been leading development. Regardless, the game's poor reception further fanned the flames of hate within Leaf's online community, until Valentine's Day 2001, when all this disdain finally reached its peak. On February 10th, a group of fans on the Leaf keyboard formed a group to create a strategy game that would portray what it was like to make games at Leaf. As the group was brainstorming story ideas in a thread, the 24th poster shared a document on February 14th, 2001 that was simply called 552.txt. The file contained logs from a private BBS forum used by several current and former Leaf employees. The topics discussed in the log were random, but many involved the staff venting their frustrations about their employer, including writer Udaru Harada. Harada expressed his stress about working at Leaf and detailed the story of his resignation, and other posters described how newly hired staff would sometimes quit right after their first day, since new employees were often given little guidance. This file was also how many fans first learned about all the departures that had occurred at the company in the previous year. Poster 24 explained that their intention with sharing this log was to simply give fans reference material to help create the story for their fan game. However, this file instead set the entire Leaf fanbase ablaze, and the original poster would later express their regret for sharing it. This new information sent the Leaf keyboard into a frenzy, and fans began lashing out, attacking people like founder Naoya Shimakawa and heavily criticizing releases by the company, such as Comic Party's recent Dreamcast port. But more than anyone else, the Leaf keyboard doubled down on their hatred for Akihide Takabayashi, the man caught up in a plagiarism scandal and who had written the most poorly received game in the company's recent history. Takabayashi quickly became the community's punching bag, turning into a scapegoat for everything they didn't like about Leaf's current situation. Takabayashi was mocked endlessly by the board, becoming the subject of a few early memes, and multiple threads were started demanding he be fired, as some fans believed it was the only way to save the company. Only a few weeks later, Leaf actually issued a statement on their website directly addressing the plagiarism scandal for the first time in March 2001. The publisher of Deki Sugi had apparently contacted Leaf about the bonus story in Kizawato, and so Leaf formally apologized and stated that it would be removed in future re-releases. While Leaf never directly stated that the story was plagiarized, this acknowledgement of guilt, as it were, only served to embolden the Leaf fanbase even further. The drama got so bad that fans began posting messages on the company's official BBS that contained hidden anagrams criticizing Leaf staff and demanding Takabayashi's resignation. So, as a retaliation, Leaf actually began publishing the offenders' email addresses to the public. This only served to anger fans more, and the Leaf BBS was shut down shortly after in August 2001. The members of the Leaf keyboard had basically started a mini internet war with the company. While offline fans may have been unaware of what was happening, this series of events created a negative undercurrent that would stick with the company for years after. Because of this, and the loss of several key creators from the Atami office, Leaf's growth as a company would begin to slow down during this period. And as for Akihide Takabayashi, the target of much of the fanbase's hatred, he would sadly pass away only 2 years later in 2003. Unbeknownst to many fans, Takabayashi had actually quietly left Leaf not long after completing Tasogaре in 2001. The final game Takabayashi worked on that was published by the company was Abyss Boat in 2002, which he wrote and directed. This often forgotten 3D horror game was announced sometime around August 2000 before it was unceremoniously given away as a New Year's gift to members of the Leaf fan club, where it eventually became a joke within the community. After his experiences at Leaf, Takabayashi thought about leaving the industry altogether, but instead worked on various Eroge titles under pseudonyms. One of the titles he is rumored to have worked on was a game called Snow, although it has never been confirmed. However, in November 2003, Takabayashi died tragically in a motorcycle accident at the young age of 32. Tetsuya Takahashi, who had known Takabayashi since junior high school, wrote about the passing of his close friend on his blog, confirming Takabayashi's death to the community. Despite their behavior towards him, the members of the Leaf keyboard mourned Takabayashi's passing, and today some fans have even looked back on titles like Tasogaре and reevaluated their quality. Leaf's sudden rise to fame clearly caused a lot of growing pains. Before Two Heart blew up in the late 90s, Leaf was a company run by a small handful of friends that had known each other since they were students, and many of which had been co-workers at TGL. Now that they had suddenly grown into a bigger studio creating multimedia properties, Leaf seems to have had a hard time adjusting to their new responsibilities as a larger company, which led to people leaving for various reasons, and Leaf being unable to deal with attacks from their own community, a new challenge in the increasingly online world. Due to all this, Leaf would, in some ways, never truly regain the influence they had at the end of 1999, and Two Heart on the PlayStation 1 would remain a ceiling that the company could never really quite break through. Over the next decade, Leaf would eventually rise back and regain some of its prominence, creating several beloved games that are thought of as all-time classics today, but not before first stumbling through the dark as they tried to find their way in the industry. The end of the 90s saw Leaf achieve great success, but the beginning of the 2000s saw them struggling in many ways. Competition was starting to become a lot more fierce within their own niche, with many different companies now creating their own novel games. Not to mention that Leaf was no longer exactly on good terms with many of their fans. Perhaps because of this, Leaf's parent company, Aquaplus, began to diversify its business by branching out into other industries. This had already begun in the 90s, when Aquaplus established a music label called Fix Records in 1999, along with a music recording studio called Studio Aqua, fitting for a developer founded by composers. However, the company also expanded into businesses that seemed totally out of left field. All the way back in 1997, the company actually founded a Subaru car tuning shop called Aqua, which is still around today under new management. Later, they opened an online wine retailer called WineFix, and in 2002, Aquaplus even began managing a few chain restaurants in the Hyogo prefecture. On top of all of these seemingly random ventures, the company also experimented with hardware development. In late 2001, Aquaplus released a handheld gaming device called Peace, a PDA-like portable that allowed users to create their own simple games on their PC and share them online, with the company even holding game creation contests on their website. Aquaplus and a few third-party developers created their own games for the machine as well, with the most famous being a pack-in title called Multi's Going Out, a simulation game featuring Multi from the Two Heart series. Peace did seem to find a niche audience, but never became a huge hit, yet another example of the strange business decisions Aquaplus was making at the time. While all this was happening, Leaf continued to produce PC games for the Aerogame market. In fact, the Tokyo office was preparing to release their next big game after Comic Party in April 2002, which would be spearheaded by director Stomu Washimi, artist Tatsuki Mizuyu, and writer Munemitsu Suga. As stated before, Suga had previously worked at a studio named Silky, where he had made a name for himself in the mid-90s, writing the scenarios for titles like Koihime and Beyond. After joining Leaf, he had assisted in writing the story for Comic Party, but for this new title, he would be responsible for the original concept and serve as the head writer. Called Utawarerumono, the game was another hybrid title, but instead of containing sim elements, Uta featured strategy RPG battles that punctuated the game's narrative. The project started with the idea that the Tokyo team wanted to create a more game-like game compared to their past titles, and Suga had the simple desire to make a story featuring characters with animal ears and tails. Thus, a fantasy story was created that centered on an amnesiac hero wearing a mysterious horned mask that is taken in by a small farming village who eventually get drawn into larger and larger conflicts. As stated in the beginning of the video, today, Utawarerumono is hands down Aquaplus's most famous franchise. It would eventually spawn various sequels, spin-offs, adaptations, and was one of the earlier blockbuster visual novels to be fan-translated during the beginning of the genre's fandom in the West. Unfortunately, at the time in 2002, Utawarerumono was not immediately popular with players like Comic Party was. While sales weren't poor, Leaf's heated relationship with their fans led to the online community meeting Uta's announcement with disdain, and it took a while before people warmed up to the title. While the Tokyo office was dealing with Utawarerumono, Leaf's main office in Atami had since moved to Osaka in June of 2000, where they developed several new titles, all of which also had their own struggles. The first was a remake of Kizawato in July 2002. Both Tetsuya Takahashi and Toru Minazuki were hired to work on the remake as freelancers, but despite their involvement, the game was met negatively by fans, who didn't like the redesigned characters and more colorful presentation. Shizuku was also later reimagined in 2004, and Kizawato was remade a second time in 2009, but none of these interpretations were very successful. Meanwhile, the Osaka team also continued to court the mainstream game market by developing a title specifically for a home console. Aquaplus's strategy since Two Heart was to create Aerogame titles for Japan's PC market, and then to port their most successful titles to consoles in order to reach a wider audience. But Osaka's newest release in 2003 would instead do the opposite and target this mainstream audience from the get-go, and was only ported to the PC later on. Not only that, but this family-friendly title would not be a novel game of any kind, but instead a fully 3D action RPG called Tenereza. While Aquaplus/Leaf had experimented with polygonal graphics with Abyss Boat, Tenereza was the company's first 3D title to be given a proper retail release, and was fairly ambitious compared to the company's usual 2D affairs. However, in a surprising move, the platform Tenereza called home was Microsoft's original Xbox. Naoya Shimakawa stated in interviews that the reason for this platform choice was because Leaf/Aquaplus had the most experience developing titles for Windows, and that their skills transferred well to the Xbox, which had a similar development architecture. Tenereza was fairly well liked by those who played it, but sadly the Xbox was a commercial failure in Japan, and Tenereza most likely didn't fare too well on the system. However, the game still ended up being surprisingly important for the company in the long run, since many of their future titles would be built using the technology they created to make Tenereza. And finally, 2003 would come to an end with both of Leaf's divisions releasing novel games for the PC. The first was released by the Osaka studio in February, called Routes, and the other was developed by the Tokyo studio in September, called December When There Is No Angel. Routes was an espionage action story that was meant to revive the Leaf visual novel series, and saw a lot of involvement from the company's president, who not only composed the title soundtrack, but also came up with the original concept, served as the game's planner, producer, and even director. December When There Is No Angel, on the other hand, was the next title to be written by Comic Party's head scenario writer, who penned a more serious story centered around characters and unhealthy relationships. But again, while these games were liked by some, they never really blew up with a mainstream audience. While Leaf was making more games than ever before, the company was clearly struggling to create a title that would really take off in the current marketplace. Looking at Leaf/Aquaplus's output in the early aughts, you really get the impression that the company was throwing everything they had at the wall to see what would stick. When that didn't work, the studio decided to try doing the opposite, combining the talents of their two offices to create one high-quality product instead of making several titles all at once. Therefore, the two teams came together and began discussing different concepts they could produce, until someone jokingly suggested, how about we make Two Heart 2? While making a sequel to a popular game may seem like a no-brainer, the developers were very apprehensive about making a follow-up to such a beloved title. In fact, Leaf and Aquaplus had never made a direct sequel to any of their games before. However, perhaps due to the lukewarm reception of their recent releases, Aquaplus may have been more willing to return to a franchise that was sure to grab people's attention. But it wouldn't be easy. The project would be one of the company's largest. While the number of love interests was similar to the first game, the script overall was much longer, with each heroine having far more artwork and story content. Additionally, since the two divisions were located in different cities, the team had to learn how to work together remotely, as they tried their best to correspond through email and early messenger apps. Eventually, Two Heart 2 was announced in 2003, where it was also revealed that the sequel would be skipping the PC and launching exclusively for home consoles. But this time around, Aquaplus would jump ship from Microsoft and hitch their bandwagon instead to the hugely successful DVD player that was the PlayStation 2. Similar to Utawarerumono, Leaf's fans met this announcement with a lot of skepticism, due to the fact that it was a sequel being created by a totally new team, and the fact that it wouldn't be an Eroge title. However, Two Heart 2 saw Aquaplus's best talents come together, with 4 writers teaming up with 4 artists to create the scenarios for the game's 9 heroines, and when it finally made its way into players' hands in December, it was well received, eventually selling 100,000 copies, almost matching the original game on the PlayStation 1. While its release didn't shock the industry like Two Heart 1, the sequel was still well liked, and the game's love interests eventually became fan favorites, with the characters often making guest appearances in future games, and new merchandise featuring the heroines being produced for years after its release. However, this success was not instant, and was a gradual process that happened over time, and due to the higher production costs compared to 1, Two Heart 2 actually ended up not making a profit on the PS2, despite its eventual popularity. This, surprisingly, led to Leaf creating an Eroge version of Two Heart 2 the next year for the PC, called Two Heart 2 X-Rated, which helped the game recoup its development costs, a rare occurrence where a console game was later re-released as an adult title. Two Heart 2 was a turning point in some ways for Aquaplus and Leaf. The sequel was the company's biggest hit since their heyday in the late 90s, and while the game's PC port was a bestseller, Leaf would begin to see diminishing returns from their PC titles going forward. Games like Tears to Tiara were received positively by players, but the Eroge industry as a whole had begun to stagnate in the early 2000s, and sales across the board were decreasing over time. Whether the cause was the shrinking PC market in Japan or the oversaturation of Eroge novel games, the PC was starting to no longer be a viable platform for a larger studio like Leaf. Additionally, as stated near the beginning of the video, many of Leaf's fans also saw the erotic content in their games as a bonus, and not the main selling point, and there was a sizable audience of people that preferred to play their games on home consoles with that content removed. And so, Aquaplus decided to make another bet on the PS2 with an enhanced port of Utawarerumono. Aquaplus had hoped to make a console port of Uta ever since the game was initially released for the PC back in 2002, but due to all the drama surrounding Leaf in the early 2000s, fans met Uta's original announcement with animosity. However, once fans actually played the game, its popularity grew through word of mouth, until it was eventually regarded as a classic among Eroge fans. Thus, Aquaplus decided to give the title another big push in the console market. But Aquaplus realized that the combat in the original version couldn't compete with the large number of strategy games in the crowded home market. So the company teamed up with a veteran developer named Flightplan, who was most famous for creating the Summon Night franchise, and commissioned them to polish and expand the gameplay in Uta's battle segments. At the same time, an anime adaptation was also produced by Aquaplus's old pals at OLM, and the show's actors and actresses lent their voices to the PS2 port as well. When both the show and the PS2 version were released in 2006, Utawarerumono was finally transformed into a mainstream success, with some sources stating that it matched 2 Heart 2 in sales. This was basically the final straw. After having 2 big sellers on the PS2, the company decided to begin transferring their eggs into the home console basket. Over the next few years, Aquaplus would begin porting almost their entire catalog onto Sony platforms, and various remakes were also created, including a complete reimagining of Tears to Tiara for the PlayStation 3. They even began creating non-PC spin-offs featuring their characters, such as 2 Heart 2 Dungeon Travelers on the PSP, and other titles like the fighting game Aquaplaza. Aquaplus was beginning to find its footing again, obtaining new fans and expanding their business into the home market. However, because of this, the Leaf brand name was being used less and less. All of Aquaplus's releases were ports or spin-offs at the time, with Leaf continuing to push themselves to create original PC titles, making a sequel to 2 Heart 2, experimenting with new concepts, creating products with different tones, returning to old ideas, and trying their hand at different genres. Sadly, sales continued to stagnate on the PC, and the company began to rely more on their console releases. As the Leaf name began to fade away, the company would receive some outside help from an unlikely source. Fans had helped build up Leaf in the 90s, and they tore them down in the 2000s. But it would also be a fan that helped Leaf create one of their most beloved classics. While Aquaplus was developing the PS3 version of Tears to Tiara, the company reached out to a scenario group called Kikakuya, where they came into contact with a writer named Fumiaki Marito. During their discussions with the group, Fumiaki mentioned how he was actually a huge fan of Leaf's White Album, one of the company's older titles from 1998. At the time of its release, White Album received a mixed reception from some fans, due to the game dealing with somber love triangles and themes of infidelity, which didn't gel well with players that were used to the pure-hearted romances featured in 2 Heart. However, the game would be regarded as a classic by some, and Marito was one of those fans. He told Aquaplus that he would love to pen a script similar to that game, which eventually led to Marito working with the studio to create 2 hugely ambitious titles that would serve as a sequel to the original White Album. The story begins as a simple school romance about a music club preparing for the upcoming cultural festival. but eventually evolves into an epic melodrama. Split between two games, the massive sequel shows how the relationships between the cast change over the course of several years, starting with their lives as high school students to college students, and finally working adults. White Album 2 was lauded by fans and critics upon its release in 2010 and 11. The title quickly obtained a legendary status and is now considered by some to be one of Leaf's best titles, and one of the greatest Bishoujo novel games of all time, a fitting end to the company that helped invent the genre in the 90s. Despite its acclaim, White Album 2 couldn't change the direction of the declining Aero game market, and both games sold similar numbers to Leaf's other recent output on the PC. Thus, Closing Chapter's release in 2011 would be the last original game to be published by Leaf, essentially serving as the subsidiary's swan song. After White Album 2, Aqua Plus announced a trilogy of new games that would not be released for the PC at all, and instead be exclusively published for the PlayStation 3, including a new entry in the Utawarerumono and Tears to Tiara series, along with a new title called Jasmine, which never had an announced platform and was later cancelled. During the development of these titles, the company was purchased by Yumi no Sora Holdings in 2013, and has since become a fully owned subsidiary, which is fitting since Yumi no Sora also owns shops that specialize in selling self-published doujin works, and now they own the company that was one of the stars of that scene. Outside of a few attempts at entering the mobile game space and other small projects, Aqua Plus has since almost fully dedicated itself to producing new entries in the Utawarerumono series, many of which have been well received by fans in Japan and abroad, thanks to the series being officially localized into English in the 2010s. Now that Aqua Plus is part of a larger company, they've also been given the resources to make bigger titles that reach an even wider audience, with Shimokawa stating in 2016 that Utawarerumono Mask of Deception had become the company's second best-selling game of all time, only bested by the first Two Heart on the PlayStation 1 once again. As the company now reaches its 30th anniversary, it seems to be branching out to create even more ambitious titles, such as their upcoming RPG, Monochrome Mobius, a fully 3D turn-based RPG set in the world of Utawarerumono, which is planned to be released in English simultaneously with Japan, a first for the company. As for Leaf, the Aero subsidiary that established all of the company's most famous franchises, it has become almost completely inactive, outside of a few re-releases, with even the company's PC titles now being published under the Aqua Plus name. Naoya Shimokawa has stated in a few interviews that he is surprised that his company has been able to continue making games for as long as it has. They were a company founded by a small group of friends that were fans of game music, who eventually garnered their own fan base over the years. They perhaps grew too quickly and were attacked by their own community, but then one of their greatest titles was created by a fan himself. In the West, while there are many people who like individual titles and franchises created by Leaf, they don't have the same fandom that surrounds companies like Key or Type Moon. However, despite that, the company's influence even on the Western fandom is still undeniable. Leaf established the modern visual novel industry most know today, and now their brand name, visual novel, serves as the de facto term for all novel-style video games in the English-speaking world, despite many not even knowing they originated the term. In many ways, Leaf is a company that represents a moment in time, a studio that kicked off a trend that eventually outgrew them. However, while many of its contemporaries have come and gone, Leaf has remained a steady constant in the industry, even if their modern titles are now released under the Aqua Plus banner. To someone only passingly familiar with the studio's small handful of officially localized titles, Leaf and Aqua Plus may just seem like another studio peddling moe girls to game fans, selling players war stories featuring cute characters with animal ears. But they've had a surprisingly large impact on the video game industry, despite their humble beginnings, and they are still around today, pushing themselves and continuing to make titles loved by fans to this day.